I have spent the last 48 hours staring at 3 flashing dots on my global earthquake monitor. 3 dots. And a single sentence from Baba Vanga. I've been cross-referencing her prophecies for 22 years, but this one sentence, I wish I had never understood what she meant. Before we get into this, if you are the kind of person who cannot let go of a pattern until you truly understand it, this channel was made for you. Subscribing keeps the algorithm on your side, so we can keep having these conversations. Because I have a lot more stories that simply will not leave me alone. I am 54 years old. I live in Springfield, Missouri. We are right in the middle of the United States. We do not have ocean views, and we do not live on the edge of a massive subduction zone. But for 22 years, I worked as a reference librarian at the Municipal Public Library. My job was the local archives, microfilm, old newspapers, dusty records kept in the basement. My entire professional life was built on verifying facts, checking the date, checking the exact source, making sure the geography matched the historical record. If someone claimed something happened, I was the guy who went into the basement to prove it or debunk it. That habit never leaves you. Even now, retired from the library, I keep my own personal database. I cross-reference historical prophetic texts with real-time disaster feeds. The National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Global Disaster Alert and Coordination System, and of course, the earthquake monitors. I like the data. Data is clean. Data does not lie. It tells a story if you know how to read it. I check the monitors every single day, mapping the seismic activity across the globe. It is a quiet routine, something to keep my mind sharp. Most days, it is just background noise. A magnitude 3 here, a magnitude 4 there. The earth breathing. I look at historical records too, tracing the lines of the 1906 San Francisco quake or the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923. You start to see how much destruction comes from the ground beneath us and how little we actually understand it. So when I saw the first alert pop up on my screen, I did what I always do. I checked the facts. It was the 25th of June, 2026. A magnitude 7.2 earthquake hit the Pacific coast of Japan. At 7:30 in the morning, local time. It was deep. 44 kilometers down. It hit an upper 6 on the Japanese intensity scale in Hachinohe, up in Aomori Prefecture. An upper 6 is not just a tremor. It is the kind of shaking where it is impossible to stand. Heavy furniture moves. Wall tiles fall. The Tohoku bullet train lines were suspended for hours. 10 people were injured. I read the initial reports coming through some of the alternative feeds, and people were already calling it the Sanriku earthquake. They were panicking, saying the Great Sanriku quake was happening again, whispering about massive tsunamis and historical devastation. But I am a librarian. I checked the coordinates. I looked at the maps. It was not Sanriku. The real Sanriku quake, a massive magnitude 7.4, happened months ago, back on the 20th of April. This new one was off the coast of Iwate and Aomori, a completely different event, a different location. I actually felt a wave of relief when I corrected that error in my database. It felt good to separate fact from online hysteria. I told myself it was just an isolated event. A big one, yes. But just a normal geological release of tension, the Earth stretching its muscles. Japan is one of the most seismically active places on the planet. This happens. I was secure in my little basement in Missouri. The facts were in their proper boxes. The world made sense. I logged the event, turned off my monitor, and went to sleep thinking the worst was over. But then, 6 days later, the 1st of July, another alert, magnitude 6.0. again off the coast of Iwate, this time closer to Hachinohe. I updated my database. 2 major quakes in the same general region of the Japan Trench in under a week. Statistically, it happens. Japan records over 1,500 detectable earthquakes every single year. Background seismicity is incredibly high there. I told myself it was just statistical noise, just the fault line settling down after the big shock on the 25th of June. An aftershock, perhaps, or just a related tremor. Nothing to lose sleep over. And then, 2 days after that, the 3rd of July, magnitude 6.1. But this one was different. It was in the East China Sea, 191 kilometers from Naha in the Ryukyu Islands, far away from the first 2, a completely different fault zone. I sat there in the dark, looking at my screen. 3 major earthquakes, all magnitude 6 or higher, all along the Asian tectonic margins, all within 8 days, from the 25th of June to the 3rd of July, 3 dots on the map. And that is when the quote from Baba Vanga hit me. I had read it years ago. I had archived it, but I had never really felt it until that moment. She had warned about seismic instability. She had said, the earth will quake in a chain, one margin calling the other, one margin calling the other. I could not sleep. I tried to go to bed, but every time I closed my eyes, I saw those 3 dots lighting up in sequence. Iwate, Hachinohe, Ryukyu. What if they were not isolated? What if the mainstream consensus was wrong and the scientists were just using statistics to hide the fact that they have absolutely no control over a domino effect happening right beneath us? I needed to know, not because I wanted to prove the prophecy right, but because I needed to know if the ground we stand on is actually speaking to itself. If I did not understand this, I felt like I would be waiting for the next dot to flash on my screen for the rest of my life, terrified that it would be the one to break the world open. I should not have opened my archives at 2 in the morning, but I did. I bypassed the standard news feeds and went straight into my scanned documents. I pulled up the old files from the Institute of Seismology in Sofia, Bulgaria. You see, most people think Baba Vanga was just an old woman telling fortunes to tourists, a blind mystic from the Balkans who spoke in riddles. But her story is far more complex. She lost her sight in a massive storm when she was a child, and according to the accounts, that is when she gained her inner vision. But what fascinates me is not the mythology. It is the documentation. During the communist era, the Bulgarian government took her so seriously that they funded a state-sponsored scientific study on her abilities. It was led by a psychiatrist named Dr. Georgi Lozanov. Imagine the Soviet bloc, completely dedicated to strict materialism and atheism, funding a scientific institute to study a mystic. That alone tells you there was something undeniable happening. I had the translated reports. Lozanov spent years documenting her verifiable predictions. And buried in those reports, kept by her niece Krasimira Stoyanova, were the detailed warnings about the Pacific Ring of Fire. The warnings did not give exact dates. They never do. But the structural image she provided was terrifyingly specific. She did not describe a single massive cataclysm. She described a cascade, a chain reaction, one fault line unzipping, transferring its burden to the next, which transfers it to the next. A chain, one margin calling the other. I stared at those words until they blurred on my screen. I was crossing a line. I was taking a mystical vision from the Cold War era and trying to map it onto real-time geophysical data from the 21st century. It felt absurd, but I could not unsee the pattern. I had seen it with my own eyes across 3 different fault zones in just 8 days. How could everyone else pretend this was just business as usual? I spent the next 3 days diving into the seismology forums. I read what the people actually living in Japan were saying. The anxiety was suffocating. People on the internet were saying, every time I feel a tremor now, my heart stops thinking this is the first of the cluster that triggers the big one. They were exhausted by the constant panic every time there was a magnitude 6 near the coast. One person in Tokyo wrote that the mental strain of waiting for the Nankai Trough megaquake after watching foreshocks hit up and down the coast is unbearable. Another person wrote, I saw the pattern with my own eyes across 3 different fault zones. How can everyone else pretend this is just business as usual? It was not just Western prophecies they were talking about. Deep in those forums, people were bringing up Ryo Tatsuki. She published a comic book diary of her premonitory dreams in 1999, called The Future I Saw. She saw cascades of earthquakes in the Pacific subduction zones. The local Japanese public was already primed for this exact nightmare scenario. The cultural anxiety was matching the geophysical data perfectly. The local authorities kept issuing advisories saying, be prepared, not panicked. But how are you supposed to stay calm when 3 separate zones activate within days of each other? How do you sleep when the ground beneath your feet feels like a ticking time bomb? And then there was the skepticism, the rational voices. I desperately wanted to agree with them. They said the 3 fault zones are geographically separate. They operate independently. A chain reaction is geophysically impossible. They said prophecies like Vanga's are just vague, retrofitted claims with no real correlation to tectonic movements. They pointed out that Japan has hundreds of tiny quakes all the time, and drawing a line between 3 of them is just confirmation bias. I almost closed my laptop. I was sitting there rubbing my tired eyes, feeling foolish. I am a librarian, for God's sake. I deal in facts. Maybe I was just seeing shapes in the clouds. Maybe the human brain is just wired to find patterns in chaos, to invent a story where there is only random noise. I was ready to shut down the database. I was ready to walk away and chalk it all up to coincidence. But wait, let me back up. Because right before I hit the power button, I remembered Kumamoto. April 2016. A magnitude 6.2 earthquake hit Kumamoto, Japan on the 14th of April. The seismologists went on television and declared it the main tremor. They mapped the fault. They measured the release of energy, and they told the public that the worst was over. People went back to their homes thinking the earth had settled. They trusted the authorities. They trusted the science. 28 hours later, on the 16th of April, a magnitude 7.0 ruptured the exact same fault line. The first one was not the main event. It was a foreshock. The scientists were wrong. The Earth did not care about their classifications or their statistical models. The people who had returned to their homes were caught entirely off guard. The psychological betrayal of that moment was devastating. That memory stopped me. It proved that sequences matter. It proved that one rupture changes the conditions for the next one, sometimes in ways that completely defy our standard expectations. It is a strange feeling, realizing that the planet you live on is essentially a giant machine, and you are just standing on the thinnest layer of its crust. We build our cities, our highways, our homes, and we pretend that the ground is solid. We use words like bedrock to mean something unchanging and permanent. But the truth is, the bedrock is moving. It is shifting. It is constantly communicating its stress to every other part of the system. I have spent my entire life surrounded by paper and microfilm dealing with the history of human actions. I never truly appreciated the history of the Earth itself until I started looking at these numbers. And the numbers tell a story that most of us are simply not prepared to hear. I could not give up yet. I dug deeper into the geophysical literature, not the news articles, the actual peer-reviewed papers. I needed to know if there was a physical mechanism that could link quakes across long distances. And that is when I found him. Dr. Ross S. Stein, Scientist Emeritus at the United States Geological Survey, founder of the earthquake hazard platform Tembler. I started reading his work on something called Coulomb stress transfer and dynamic triggering. I read it once. I read it twice. And then the bottom fell out of my stomach. It is not magic. It is not supernatural. It is fluid dynamics and physics. When a massive earthquake happens, like a magnitude 7 or higher, it does not just shake the ground and stop. It generates high-amplitude surface waves, Rayleigh waves, and love waves. These waves travel across tectonic boundaries. They roll through the Earth's crust like ripples in a pond, and as they pass through distant fault lines, they alter the fluid pressure deep underground. They change the stress fields, even by just a few bars of pressure. And that tiny shift in pressure is enough to accelerate a fault line's failure from a timescale of decades down to a timescale of days. The ruptures transfer their stress to neighboring segments. It is a literal transfer of kinetic energy and geological burden. Dr. Stein and his colleagues proved this, especially after the Great Tohoku earthquake of 2011. They published studies showing how that massive event altered the stress across the entire region, loading the gun for future ruptures. Geographic separation alone does not rule out a triggering relationship. A quake in one zone can absolutely load the gun in another zone hundreds of miles away. I sat back in my chair. The room was perfectly silent, but my mind was roaring. The skeptics were wrong. The background seismicity being high does not erase the physics. The 3 earthquakes were not statistical noise. They were a cascade. Baba Vanga did not need a degree in geophysics. She did not know what a Rayleigh wave was. She did not know the mathematical formula for Coulomb stress transfer, but she saw the structure of reality. She saw the chained quaking. She saw one margin calling the other. And science had just provided the exact physical mechanism for how that call is answered. It was not what I expected to find. I thought I would either debunk the prophecy entirely or find some vague mystical confirmation. Instead, I found physics validating a mystic. Physics. The boundary between science and prophecy completely dissolved. I wanted an answer, and I got one. But I would give it back if I could. Because finding out that the pattern is real, finding out that the Earth really does communicate its breaking points across thousands of miles, means I can never look at my monitor the same way again. I used to look at an earthquake as an isolated tragedy, an event with a beginning, a middle, and an end. A single rupture that releases tension and then goes quiet. Now, every time I see a magnitude 6 pop up on the feed, I do not see an event. I see a domino falling. I see a transfer of stress. There is a terrible burden in knowing that the ground is fundamentally unstable and that it works like an interconnected network. I cannot go back to the comfortable ignorance of thinking things happen randomly. I lost my distance. I am sitting thousands of miles away in Missouri, safe from the tsunamis and the shaking, but I feel intimately connected to the fault lines under the Pacific. The distance is gone. The illusion of safety through separation is gone. You do not unlearn a paradigm shift like this, you just learn to carry it. Every time you read the news, every time the ground shakes, you are waiting for the next link in the chain to snap. Remember when I said I spent the last 48 hours staring at 3 flashing dots on my monitor? I was terrified of those 3 dots because I thought they were random. I thought they represented a chaotic, unpredictable, and uncontrollable universe. I was right to be terrified, but for the completely wrong reason. They are not chaotic. They are perfectly, brutally logical. They are the Earth following the strict laws of physics, transferring its immense stress from one breaking point to the next, just like she warned. The question was never whether it was just a coincidence. The question was why we are so desperate to believe it is a coincidence. I do not know when the next link in the chain will break. I do not know if the Nankai Trough is next, or if the stress has safely dispersed into the ocean floor. But I do know that I am fundamentally changed. I am no longer someone who looks at isolated facts in a vacuum. I cannot be that naive reference librarian anymore, putting events into neat little boxes. We have to stop looking at these events as separate headlines on different days. The warnings were right. The Earth quakes in a chain. I do not know what to do with this information. But I know I could not keep it to myself. I had to share it, because the more of us who understand the pattern, the less blind we are when the next margin answers the call. I want to take a second here. A lot of you watch these videos and move on. But for those of you who stay, who really listen, I want to say thank you. Bringing these connections to light, diving into the archives and the data, it takes time. It takes a toll. If this perspective gave you something valuable today, if it shifted how you see the world even a little bit, consider using the super thanks button below. It is what allows me to keep digging, to keep asking the questions that most people ignore. You are not just a viewer. You are part of the investigation, so I have to ask you, does this make you feel more anxious? Or does knowing the scientific mechanism actually bring you some weird kind of peace? Tell me in the comments if I am overthinking this, or if you feel the exact same way. I really want to know. When you spend 22 years answering questions for people in a public library, you learn something fundamental about human nature. We crave certainty. People would come to my desk asking for a specific date, a specific name, a specific historical fact. They wanted the world to fit into a neat, easily understandable narrative. And for a long time, I believed it did. I believed that if you just looked hard enough, you could find the single, isolated cause for any event. But the deeper you go into seismology, the more you realize that causality is a web, not a straight line. Every tremor is the result of 1,000 other tremors that happened years, decades, or even centuries ago. We are living in the echo chamber of geological time, and that is what makes prophecies so difficult to digest for someone like me. A prophecy does not give you a neat chain of causality. It leaps over the how and goes straight to the what. It tells you the outcome without showing you the work. As a librarian, that infuriates me. I want to see the references. I want to see the citations. But when Dr. Stein's work perfectly explains Baba Vanga's vision, I am forced to confront the fact that there are different ways of knowing. There is the slow, painstaking accumulation of data, and then there is whatever inner vision she possessed. And when those two completely different methods point to the exact same terrifying reality, you have to stop being a skeptic and start being an observer. I sit here in my basement in Missouri, surrounded by the archives of human history, and I realize how small it all is compared to the forces moving beneath the Pacific. We argue over politics and economics, while the very foundation of our world is quietly loading the next rupture. The Earth does not care about our borders. A wave of kinetic energy does not ask for a passport before it crosses a tectonic plate. It just moves. It transfers its burden, and we are left to deal with the consequences. This is the reality that the mystics saw, And this is the reality that the scientists are now proving. We are not isolated. None of these events are isolated. They are all part of the same continuous, unbroken chain of planetary motion. And every time a new dot flashes on my screen, I am reminded of just how fragile our illusion of permanence really is.